In preparation for our first attempt at performing turns around a point, we're going to take a few minutes to discuss the key elements of the maneuver. As with all other maneuvers, turns around a point has three main elements that the pilot needs to concentrate on: directional control, altitude control, and airspeed control. The goal of this maneuver is to fly 2 constant radius circles around a selected reference point on the ground, correcting for wind drift. Keep in mind that your maximum bank should not exceed 45 degrees. If you find yourself needing more than that, you are too close to your reference and should widen your circle out. Similar to the other ground reference maneuvers, the airplane's ground speed will constantly be changing as it transitions between tailwinds, crosswinds, and headwinds. These different relative winds will require a constantly changing angle of bank as well as various amounts of crabbing to maintain that constant radius. When flying on the downwind heading, your ground speed will be the greatest. This part of the circle will require the steepest angle of bank and the fastest rate of turn. When flying on the upwind heading, your ground speed will be the least. This part of the circle will require the shallowest angle of bank and the slowest rate of turn. You can therefore see that to maintain this constant radius, the airplane's bank and rate of turn will gradually but continuously change in proportion to the ground speed. To enter the maneuver, fly on a downwind heading towards the right side of your reference at the distance you wish your radius to be. Approaching a beam your reference, roll in the initial bank rapidly enough so the bank is reached abeam the point. Remember that the downwind is where the steepest bank occurs, so your initial bank should also be your steepest bank. Gradually and continuously decrease your bank as you slowly transition into a headwind. As you continue the turn towards the downwind side, the wind will be transitioning from a tailwind to a crosswind. You will have to progressively turn the nose of the airplane towards your reference point as you turn into the wind. This will prevent the airplane from being blown away from your reference point. As the airplane is faced into the wind, your bank should be at its shallowest, since this is the point at which your ground speed will be at its slowest. On the upwind half of the turn, the nose of the airplane should be pointing away from your point and into the wind to keep the airplane from being blown back towards your reference point. As the airplane is turned back into the wind, the bank angle must be gradually and consistently increased to compensate for the increasing ground speed. Continue to do so until you finally end up abeam your point on the downwind in your steepest bank angle, just as you were at the beginning of the maneuver. You may find wind correction easier to handle if you plan ahead. Note the distance you are from your reference. Then, find a landmark at that same distance, 90 degrees ahead in the circle. Watch for any drift as you attempt to fly over that next landmark. Adjust your bank as necessary. Pick a new reference every 90 degrees. Throughout the maneuver, it is important that you divide your attention both inside and outside the airplane in order to maintain a constant altitude. Using a combination of the horizon, wingtips, and instruments will help you keep your original altitude as you complete turns around a point. The primary flight instrument you will be using to control the pitch is the attitude indicator. Since the bank varies throughout the maneuver, the back pressure on the yoke will have to be increased when flying downwind, where you use the greatest bank, and decreased when flying upwind, where you use the shallowest bank. Back up the attitude indicator with your altimeter and VSI to maintain your altitude. If you lose or gain altitude, make the appropriate pitch and power adjustments, but do not change the bank angle from what is required to complete the maneuver satisfactorily. While performing turns around a point, it is important that you maintain a constant indicated airspeed. This will allow you to better anticipate the changes in your ground speed as the airplane transitions between tailwinds, headwinds, and crosswinds. As the bank angle changes throughout the turn, the amount of induced drag will also change. This change in drag could potentially cause small changes to the airplane's indicated airspeed. Monitor your power settings throughout the maneuver and make small adjustments as necessary to keep your airspeed constant. To perform turns around a point, you must first determine the wind direction. Use visual references such as smoke, lakes, flags, or even a wind drift circle in order to accurately determine where the wind is coming from. Once you know the wind direction, you can begin to set up for the maneuver. As with all maneuvers, perform clearing turns and make a position report on the appropriate practice area frequency. In order to fly turns around a point, you will need a ground reference point. Select a reference point that is easily identifiable from all sides and small enough that you can easily identify your radius of turn. Be sure that you select an area in which an emergency landing can be made if necessary. Establish and maintain 100 knots indicated airspeed and enter the maneuver on a downwind to one side of the selected point. You must enter close enough that when you lower the wing to begin the turn, the wing will not block your view of the point. Once you begin the turn on the downwind, remember that your ground speed will be at its fastest. As the airplane passes a beam your point, begin your turn by rolling at a fairly high rate to your steepest bank. This bank angle should be less than 45 degrees in normal conditions. Gradually decrease your bank angle to your shallowest bank as the ground speed decreases through the first half of the turn. Additionally, crab towards your reference to prevent you from drifting away from your point. As you begin the upwind portion of the maneuver, gradually increase your bank angle so that you end up in your steepest bank at the same point at which you began the maneuver. Additionally, remember to crab away from your reference this time, as to not drift towards your point. Perform 2 complete turns around your point and exit on your entry heading at the same altitude and airspeed at which you began. Once you have exited the maneuver, set cruise power, retrim the airplane, and complete the cruise checklist. Now that we've covered how to fly the maneuver, let's look at the end goals for your skills in turns around a point. Some of the standards for the end-of-course check ride include: select a suitable reference area that includes an emergency landing site within gliding distance in case of an engine failure. Plan the maneuver so that you enter between 600 and 1,000 feet AGL on the downwind and at an appropriate distance from your reference point. Apply wind drift correction to track a constant radius turn around the selected reference point. Divide attention between airplane control and the ground track while maintaining coordinated flight. Maintain your altitude, plus or minus 100 feet, and airspeed, plus or minus 10 knots.
In preparation for our first attempt at performing S-turns, we're going to take a few minutes to discuss the key elements of the maneuver. As with all other maneuvers, an S-turn has 3 main areas that the pilot needs to concentrate on: directional control, altitude control, and airspeed control. The primary intent of performing S-turns is to teach pilots how to compensate for the effects of wind on the plane's ground track by using varying bank angles. This means bank control will be the central feature in this maneuver. Heading references will be used more for orientation than for any other purpose because the pilot's attention will be primarily on the reference line and the plane's position relative to it. To break the maneuver down in a simple way, think of it as making 2 180-degree turns in opposite directions. The first 180 you will be making is on the downwind side of the reference line. The other is on the upwind side. On the downwind side, the bank will be continually decreasing, and on the upwind side, the bank will be continually increasing. You enter the turn on a downwind. During your first turn, you'll start with your maximum bank, not to exceed 45 degrees, as your wings cross the reference line. As the tailwind changes to a crosswind and then to a headwind, the bank angle must be reduced accordingly to maintain the symmetry of the turn. Begin reducing that bank in a way that will result in a symmetric half circle. On the upwind side, it's just the opposite. You will start with your minimum bank as your wings cross the reference line and continually increase the bank until right before you cross over the reference line going the opposite direction. At that point, you will need to rapidly roll out the bank so that the wings are level as you cross over the line. Because your ground speed is greater on the downwind portion of each turn, your rate of turn will have to be greater. This means you will have less time to complete those segments of the turn compared to the upwind portions. During this portion of the turn, the nose of the airplane will need to be crabbed progressively towards the reference line to keep the radius of the turn from increasing. On the upwind portion, the airplane will be turned in a crab away from the reference to keep the radius of the turn from decreasing. The stronger the wind, the more noticeable this will be. You should be aware of this aspect of the maneuver and avoid the tendency to try and hurry the upwind portion. Additionally, do not try to hurry or slow the turns by using more or less rudder than that required for proper coordination. Although you can use the rudder to yaw the plane one way or another, Failure to maintain proper coordination will be considered unsatisfactory performance. S-turn should be performed at 1,000 feet AGL. Establish your altitude prior to entering the maneuver. When directly over the reference line, roll into the first turn, pivoting about a point on the horizon. Use primarily visual references, but also cross-check your instruments to confirm you are maintaining altitude. The primary flight instrument you'll be using to control the pitch is the attitude indicator. Since the bank varies throughout the maneuver, the back pressure on the yoke will have to be increased when flying downwind where you use the greatest bank, and decreased when flying upwind where you use the shallowest bank. Back up the attitude indicator with your altimeter and VSI to maintain your altitude. If you lose or gain altitude, make the appropriate pitch and power adjustments, but do not change the bank angle from what is required to complete the maneuver satisfactorily. The airspeed to be used for S-turns is 100 knots. Once you have selected your reference line and are established at 1,000 feet AGL, set the power to approximately 2,200 RPM to maintain 100 knots. Trim the airplane for that speed. A slight increase in power may be necessary if you roll into 30 degrees or more of bank, but be sure to reduce that power when the bank is less than 30 degrees. Normally, only small power adjustments will be needed to maintain the airspeed within 10 knots of the entry speed. In order to begin the maneuver, you must select a suitable ground reference line based on the direction of the wind. The reference line must be perpendicular to the wind so that the maneuver can be performed as required by the PTS. The reference line should also be long enough to allow the airplane to make at least one complete S-turn. For safety purposes, there should be no other airplanes in the general vicinity, and an emergency landing site should be available in case a forced landing is required. Prior to beginning the maneuver, position the airplane so that it's upwind from the reference line. When you're ready to start the maneuver, establish 100 knots and 1,000 feet AGL, then turn directly downwind so that the plane will be perpendicular to the reference line as it crosses over it. Note the heading you are flying. When the plane is directly over the road, roll into your steepest bank not to exceed 45 degrees. It is recommended that you make the first turn to the left so that you have a better view of the ground track, but a turn in either direction is permissible. As the plane turns, the bank will need to be reduced gradually to keep the radius of the turn constant. Remember, the ground speed of the airplane determines how much bank will be needed. The faster the ground speed is, the steeper the bank required. The slower the ground speed is, the shallower the bank required. As the plane passes through the 90-degree point of the turn, note your distance from the reference line. This is the same distance that you will need to be on the upwind side of the reference line. From this point, the bank will continue to be gradually reduced so that the plane is perpendicular to the reference line as you cross over it. The heading indicator should also indicate 180 degrees from the heading you were on when you entered the maneuver. Now that the plane is flying directly into the wind, your ground speed is at its lowest, which means the bank angle will be at its shallowest. Roll in the bank at a rate that will allow the plane to get the same distance from the reference line as you were on the downwind side. For the last 90 degrees of the turn, the bank will be increased as the ground speed increases. Just prior to reaching the reference line, the bank will need to be rolled out rapidly so that the wings are level just as the plane crosses the line. After completing the second turn, set the cruise power, retrim as necessary, and complete the cruise checklist. Now that we've covered how to fly the maneuver, let's look at the end goals for your skills for S-turns. Some of the standards for the end-of-course check ride include: select a suitable ground reference line, plan the maneuver as to enter at 600 to 1,000 feet AGL perpendicular to the selected reference line, apply adequate wind drift correction to track a constant radius turn on each side of the selected reference line, reverse the direction of the turn directly over the selected reference line, divide attention between airplane control and the ground track while maintaining coordinated flight, maintain altitude plus or minus 100 feet, and maintain airspeed plus or minus 10 knots.
Prior to attempting steep turns, let's break the maneuver down into its key elements. As with most maneuvers, you will be required to meet certain standards in three main areas: heading control, altitude control, and airspeed control. We will look at each of these areas individually before we bring them all together to perform the maneuver. A steep turn consists of a 360-degree turn. That means that the heading you roll out on will be the same as what you rolled in on. While performing the turn, you will also have to maintain a constant bank of 45 degrees. Here's what needs to be done to complete the turn within the standards prescribed for heading and bank control. Select a prominent landmark near the horizon to use for rolling in and out of the maneuver, and note the heading you are on. Bug the heading indicator if that will help you to keep track of your entry heading. To begin this maneuver, roll into a 45-degree bank. Reference the attitude indicator to help establish the proper bank. You want to be smooth and deliberate with the roll-in. Once you have established 45 degrees of bank, neutralize the ailerons. While in the bank, be aware that you may have to apply a slight amount of opposite aileron to counteract the plane's overbanking tendency. Keep looking outside for traffic and maintain orientation to your entry heading as you progress through the turn. You're not going to be able to see your outside heading reference until nearing the completion of the turn, so maintain orientation by tracking it on the heading indicator. As the landmark comes back into view, start thinking about rolling out. The rollout should be started 20 to 25 degrees before the initial heading is reached. At that point, smoothly roll out the bank so as to arrive at wings level at the same time you reach the entry heading. Use the rudder throughout the maneuver to maintain a zero yaw condition. This is accomplished by referencing the slip-skid indicator. Because the plane's left turning tendencies will tend to cancel out most of the adverse yaw, you will need very little rudder when turning to the left. Turning to the right, however, will require some right rudder to counteract both adverse yaw and the plane's left turning tendencies. The greatest amount of rudder will be necessary when rolling into and out of the turns. While in straight and level flight, establish your visual reference for level flight and cross-check that with your attitude indicator. Since the maneuver is performed at a speed which is less than a normal cruise speed, the nose will be pitched up slightly higher than what you're used to. You should anticipate the horizon being about 3 inches above the tip of the Cessna's nose. The attitude indicator should also show a slight nose-up attitude. Start to roll into the bank, pivoting about a point on the horizon. As you pass through 30 degrees of bank, you will need to increase back pressure on the yoke, increasing the pitch 1 degree. Once your 45-degree bank is established, you can trim the plane nose up to help maintain the necessary back pressure. Anticipate adding 2 turns on the trim wheel. While you are performing your turns, the bulk of your work will be spent on maintaining your altitude. A lot of the work towards this can be minimized by simply looking outside and keeping an eye on your visual cues. Everyone is going to have their own method of doing so, but the principles are all the same. A popular method you can try is watching how the horizon slices through the airplane's nose. Because the horizon intersects the nose at an angle, a change in pitch will be indicated by the horizon sliding left or right. In a left bank, if you increase your pitch, the intersection of the horizon with the nose will slide to the left. A decrease in pitch will slide the horizon to the right. In a right bank, the horizon will slide just the opposite. This visual cue will be one of the best aids you can use for altitude control. The key is to find the exact spot that the horizon should intersect the nose, and then hold it there. Be aware, though, that the horizon will intersect at different points for the left and right turns. This is because your seat is located on the left side of the plane. You will still need to cross-check your instruments to confirm you are maintaining altitude. The primary flight instrument you will be using to control the pitch is the attitude indicator. Keeping the chevron slightly above the artificial horizon will ensure that you maintain the pitch attitude for level flight. Back up the attitude indicator with your altimeter and VSI to maintain your altitude. Make adjustments to your pitch based on what the altimeter and VSI tell you. When your altimeter is stable and your VSI is not showing a climb or descent, then you know you have the correct pitch for level flight. If you've lost altitude and you want to climb back up to the base altitude, roll out a little bank and increase the pitch slightly. The opposite applies if you gain altitude during the maneuver. You can roll in a little extra bank and slightly decrease the pitch. With either of these changes, make sure you don't deviate more than 5 degrees off of the 45 degrees that you're supposed to maintain. Keep an eye on your airspeed and add or reduce power as necessary. If only a small altitude change is required, simply increasing or decreasing your bank can sometimes provide enough change in vertical lift that you won't have to change your pitch at all. Nearing completion of the turn, as bank is reduced, you will need to reduce back pressure on the yoke. Do this in a smooth manner that maintains the entry altitude. If you decided to use the trim, don't forget that you will need to retrim the plane again once the bank is rolled out. Prior to beginning the maneuver, you will need to establish 95 knots. Approximately 2,150 RPM should get you close to the desired speed. Add or decrease RPM until the speed stabilizes at 95. Then use that power setting as your base RPM. As the bank is rolled in and you begin to apply back pressure to the yoke, gradually add another 100 to 200 RPM. Verify that the speed remains at 95 knots. Keep in mind that if you're climbing or descending, your airspeed will not maintain 95 knots. If you notice you are in a climb or a descent, first level off, then check the airspeed indicator. You must be in level flight to get an accurate indication of whether or not the power setting will maintain the desired airspeed. As the bank is rolled out and you are lowering the pitch, you will need to smoothly reduce the power setting back to the RPM at which you entered the maneuver. After performing clearing turns and making a position report, establish straight and level flight at 95 knots with approximately 2,150 RPM. Select a prominent landmark near the horizon to use for rolling in and out of the maneuver, and note the heading that you are on. Also, make note of your altitude. This will be your base altitude for the maneuver. Once you've established your airplane in straight and level flight at 95 knots, you are now ready to begin the maneuver. Prior to rolling into the first turn, clear the wing in the direction of your turn. Once you have confirmed that there are no collision hazards, begin rolling in the 45 degrees of bank. At the same time, apply rudder as necessary to maintain coordination. As you roll through 30 degrees of bank, you will need to begin applying back pressure on the yoke to maintain altitude and adding power to maintain airspeed. With the bank established, retrim the airplane and divide your attention inside and outside the airplane. Make sure the outside pitch reference and the attitude indicator are both showing the pitch attitude required for level flight. The altimeter should show a constant altitude, and the VSI should show neither a climb nor descent. Glance at the airspeed indicator to verify that the airspeed is within 10 knots of your entry airspeed. Add or reduce power as necessary to maintain 95 knots. Within 20 to 25 degrees of the entry heading, begin smoothly rolling out the bank and applying the necessary rudder to maintain coordination. As the bank is rolling out, release the extra back pressure, return the power to its initial setting, and retrim the airplane. After the first turn is completed, immediately roll into a turn in the opposite direction and perform the maneuver again. At the conclusion of both turns, set cruise power, retrim the plane for your new speed, and complete the cruise checklist. Now that we've covered how to fly the maneuver, let's look at the end goals for your skills in performing steep turns. The standards for the end-of-course check ride include: establish the manufacturer's recommended speed. Roll into a coordinated 360-degree turn. Maintain a 45-degree bank. Perform the maneuver in the opposite direction, as specified by the examiner. Maintain the entry altitude plus or minus 100 feet. Maintain entry airspeed plus or minus 10 knots. Maintain entry bank plus or minus 5 degrees. Roll out on entry heading plus or minus 10 degrees.